Welcome to Justice Counts, the podcast that goes beyond the law to what's important to you. Equal justice for all is a guidepost for our nation, but how do we achieve that? Here are your hosts, writer-commentator Bob Gatty and novelist-attorney Mark M. Bello.
Elisa Collins is the Chief Executive Officer at Discovery NP Legal Consultants. It's the largest group of U.S.-based clinically active specialty nurse practitioners consulting behind the scenes for trial attorneys. The firm helps trial attorneys from the occasional medical malpractice case picked up by a boutique personal injury firm to servicing large firms with volume work, and was named the best legal nurse consultant in 2022 by Attorney at Law magazine. Elisa has been an RN since 2003. She obtained her master's in nursing in 2013 and has worked clinically in cardiology, sleep medicine, weight management, and geriatric wellness. She began consulting for trial attorneys on malpractice cases in 2018. Through her own consulting, Elisa developed the industry-shaking, versatile, cloud-based, collaborative, real-time work product that is used at Discovery NP Legal Consultants and is the primary mentor, educator, and coordinator of consulting services there. She's recruited a growing team of 14 advanced practice registered nurses to join her team and is administrator of an online community of hundreds of nurse practitioners who are consultants to the legal profession. Elisa has also a master's degree in psychology with an emphasis in life coaching. She lives with her husband in Boise, Idaho, and takes care of her mother-in-law and for her own 2 children, one of whom is bedbound and medically fragile. So Elisa enjoys the freedom and flexibility that consulting for the legal profession is afforded while continuing to be a healthcare advocate for patients. Elisa Collins, welcome to Justice Counts.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Elisa. Here's Mark Bello to kick things off. Mark?
So I'm a lawyer, and I'm looking for a nurse consultant. What exactly should I look for?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Mark. It's a really common question. First of all, a legal nurse consultant basically helps attorneys, trial attorneys primarily, in any kind of case that involves medical records of any kind, really, or sometimes we can help in criminal cases, basically anything that involves physical injuries. And specifically, we can help in medical malpractice cases to identify the standard of care, which is something that I think is a little bit more difficult for a layperson stepping in to be able to speak to. But we can also help with any kind of personal injury case, workman's comp cases, Social Security disability cases, probate cases. Sometimes there's questions about people's cognitive abilities on probate cases. And as I said, criminal cases such as investigating homicides or sexual assaults it could be helpful to have a nurse assist with that. But yeah, that key case that everyone thinks of is the medical malpractice and medical.
How does a lawyer vet a legal nurse consultant? Does it depend on the type of case?
Yeah, absolutely. Legal nurse consultants tend to specialize. Some legal nurse consultants will tell you that they can handle any type of case, and that's fine. But legal nurse consultants specialize in their consulting, and it usually lines up with what they specialized in their clinical practice. There's some that will tell you that you need to look for a certified legal nurse consultant. There's a handful of certifications available out there. However, the reality is that there's really no overarching regulatory body in legal nurse consulting that is going to prevent nurses from entering the space of consultation for the legal profession. And so there's those out there that use certification as sort of a marketing advantage because there are so many legal nurse consultants. There are thousands of them. I would say thousands upon thousands of them. At least it seems like sometimes, especially if you're on LinkedIn and you receive messages here and there from someone asking you, hey, does anyone help with your medical records. So certification is nice to have for marketing perspective, from the marketing perspective for a legal nurse consultant. However, the certifications come in all shapes and sizes. And I would say what's most important is that the clinical background and experience of that nurse matches and aligns with what your case is involving. So that's the most important thing. So you're going to see people out there that claim to be sort of a jack of all trades or Jill of all trades. And you're also going to see those who put themselves out there as a master of one. And I would say that for the sake of your plaintiff in each individual case, you would want the master of one on each individual case.
Now, in a legal case, do both sides hire nurse consultants? And if so, what tips the scales between dueling nurses?
That is a good question as well. So defense firms tend to specialize in defending healthcare professionals and healthcare facilities. And so they usually will have nurses in-house, which makes a lot of sense for them because they specialize in that. However, a lot of firms that take medical malpractice sort of dabble in medical malpractice and they don't have enough of it to necessarily put someone on staff. And so it makes a lot more sense to hire consultants, especially because you're only doing a handful of cases per year. And the chances are, you may have a surgery case and then over here you have an obstetrics case or a spinal injury case or something like that. And so you'll have different types of cases where the same nurse won't make sense for all three of those cases. And so for a plaintiff firm, they're more likely to want to contract someone out. But as far as what makes one stand up against the other, they can have qualifications on both sides. And so it really just comes down to the strength of the clinical arguments, I would say.
Okay, well, what's the difference between a practicing nurse, a legal nurse consultant, a nurse practitioner? What's the difference between these specialties anyway?
That's really two questions. I would just to kind of clarify the difference between a legal nurse consultant, LNC, versus a nurse practitioner consultant to the legal profession. They perform similar functions in the legal world as far as consulting for the attorney. However, their clinical background is quite different. So it sort of mirrors the difference between a registered nurse and an advanced practice registered nurse. Advanced practice registered nurses have 2 to 4 more years of formal education, sometimes as many as 6 years more formal education than a registered nurse. So the entry level of a registered nurse, as far as I know, is still an associate's degree. However, most nurses these days, RNs, have a bachelor's degree. Nurse practitioners must enter with, I believe it is still a master's degree, at least those who were entering in 2013. When I became a nurse practitioner, we could still enter with a master's degree. And so that may still be sort of the grandfathered entry level. However, it's leaning more towards nurse practitioners entering with a doctorate of nurse practitioner or DNP. Okay. So about 3.5% of RNs will go on to become nurse practitioners. So it's an extremely elite group. Advanced practice registered nurses can be nurse practitioners, certified registered nurse anesthetists, which is a CRNA who function much in the capacity of an anesthesiologist, except that they have a nursing background. Mm-hmm. They can also be clinical nurse specialists who tend to focus on leadership positions rather than direct patient care, and then also certified nurse midwives. So they function at the provider level, but they can actually deliver babies. So those are the 4 types, and nurse practitioners, being one of those types in the United States, can function really quite independently, autonomously. We can actually diagnose and prescribe and care for the patient across the lifespan, independent of a physician oversight.
Okay.
You don't want your legal nurse consultant to deliver your baby.
Well, if they are also a legal nurse consultant must also be a nurse, of course. You want your legal nurse consultant to have been a nurse. But you actually bring up a really good point, because actually in-house legal nurse consultants is sometimes something that people kind of start thinking, well, wouldn't it be more affordable if I were to get an in-house legal nurse consultant? And I'll tell you, one of the disadvantages that you have to think about on that is if you want that person to work in a full-time capacity for your firm, then that will preclude them from being able to work also clinically at the same time and remain clinically active. And so that they kind of lose a little bit of that being in touch with the current standards of practice and standards of care. So actually what you said is correct. If they are just a legal nurse consultant, you wouldn't necessarily want them to be delivering your baby. So, but that being said, they can still speak to some general issues spotting
they lose their practice. They lose their practice flexibility. So,
right.
So I'm a lawyer. I've got a tough case. I'm working on a strict budget. Money's precious. I'm young. Maybe it's my first case or one of my first 10 cases. I've got a doctor. I've spent a lot of money hiring this expert doctor, and he's a specialist in the field of my case. And he's rendered an opinion. He's going to be testifying. Why would I also need a behind-the-scenes nurse consultant? What is she going to do that's going to justify the extra cost I have to spend?
I love that question. I'm actually going to suggest that if you were to rewind that hypothetical scenario, probably should have hired the behind the scenes legal nurse consultant before getting to the point of hiring the testifying expert. And you would have saved many thousands of dollars. So I like to think of it like this. If you've been shaving your entire life, and things generally go pretty well, but you cut yourself up many times throughout your life, and you realize that at some point someone points out to you that there's this product and it's called shaving cream, and you go, what is this shaving cream thing? And they explain to you, all you have to do is put this on your face, and then when you shave, it will just glide across your face. And it can be, really, it can just open you up to a whole new world of what it could be like. So you still need that razor. You're still going to need that expert witness. There's no question. You can't shave without a razor, but it does make it a lot easier to shave with shaving cream. Let's put it that way.
That explains a lot.
Yeah, it really does.
So wait a minute. You're saying that a that a legal nurse, whatever you call it, is.
I'm going to have to correct you on that one. It's in this case we're talking about a nurse practitioner consultant to the legal profession, and I think it's a distinction.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So that you're comparing that person to shaving.
Exactly. Yeah. So we're going to make that process a lot less painful and smoother, a little less bloody.
Okay.
Right. Because what a nurse practitioner consultant to the legal profession can do from the perspective of both a provider and a nurse. And that's one of the advantages. We spoke earlier about the difference between a nurse practitioner and a nurse. And I had mentioned that a nurse practitioner functions essentially on the same plane as a physician. We're held to the same standards of care in diagnosing, using what's called differential diagnosis to try and determine what the diagnosis is. And then the treatment, the evidence-based treatment that we use is the same as a physician's standard of care. And so, and I'm so sorry, Bob, I think I started going down a wrong path. What were you just
Who's the lawyer in this shaving scenario?
Yes, thank you. The lawyer is shaving. And depending on the needs of the lawyer, the shaving could be whatever part of the body makes sense for that person. So the nurse practitioner consultant to the legal profession can make that process a lot less painful, smoother, and just a lot fewer nicks along the way. And we do that by essentially priming the medical record for that expert witness. So imagine this, you've got 10,000 pages of medical records. Typically what happens is the expert witness gets 10,000 pages thrown at them and they're told, find the needle in the haystack. And they go, oh, you're paying me by the hour, right? And yes, of course you're paying them either by the page or by the hour. And so of course they love to see 10,000 pages thrown at them in no particular order whatsoever. However, if you were to hand them the 1,000 pages that you already know contain the smoking gun, and I'm mixing my metaphors here, but if you were to throw them the 1,000 pages that contain the needle and then say, find the needle, it's going to take them a lot fewer hours because you already had someone of a similar background at about 1/3 the cost to hunt through those pages initially, find the smoking gun, isolate the pages that are most relevant, because you have all sorts of pages that are irrelevant, especially when you start talking about nursing home cases where there's thousands and thousands of pages, tens of thousands of pages. These patients live in the nursing home and they have pages of information each day of their life. So that adds up very quickly. But if you want to isolate down those pages that make the most sense for this case and then hand that expert witness those pages, you want those to have been extracted by a specialist. And a specialist with a similar background to the testifying expert. And they can tell you what that narrative is before you go to hire the expert. And when you do go hire the expert, they can give you advice as to who would be a good expert for this case, and then a testifying expert. And then when you sit down to interview that testifying expert, you'll know what questions to ask them to elicit the narrative that you already know is inside those records, because you already know what it is, as opposed to just giving it to them and saying, figure it out for me. So that's how a nurse practitioner consultant to the legal profession can be helpful. And besides which, if it's a nursing standard of care that's been violated, a nurse practitioner consultant can speak to both that nursing side and the nurse practitioner side, or the provider side, because the nurse practitioner has been a nurse usually for many years, sometimes upwards of 10 plus years before she ever went back to become a nurse practitioner. So if there's standards of care that were violated on a nursing level, she can call those out as well. And so it's kind of a sweet spot between nurses and physicians. And it's a lot more affordable than a physician.
What an important answer that was. For you young lawyers out there, what Alyssa just said is that the involvement of a nurse consultant is going to save you money, not cost you money. So it's a good idea to get one involved, especially, I guess you're saying, before you hire the expert. Maybe she can help you qualify the expert, qualify the case for an expert, and save you money on the expert as well as saving you money on the document review, correct?
Right. How I would go about it is I would do the pre-priming, where I would isolate the pages that were most relevant to the case. I would help the attorney to select the right expert, testifying expert. I would even help any part of that. I can help interview them. I can help with looking at their CV, what have you. And once that person has been located, then I can give them those pages that are most relevant and ask them very pointed questions about their opinion. And if it's not in alignment with what the narrative that we're hoping we would go with, then we can move on to the next expert that can support the case better. So you're not going to find yourself up a creek where you've hired an expert that just disagrees with you completely.
I love it.
I would think that it would also be a big time saver, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, especially for the attorney. And the way that I put it is, if you value your time, your own time, at any more than what this legal nurse consultant or nurse practitioner consultant to the legal profession is asking for his or her time, then you're saving money. And a lot of attorneys tell me, well, I don't bill hourly. I'm a contingency paid attorney. And I say, well, there's always an hourly in there. If you were to hypothetically look at that contingency payout and then divide it by the number of hours you spent on the case, there's an hourly number in there. And I certainly hope that it's going to be higher than what you'll find a legal nurse consultant or a nurse practitioner consultant to the legal profession bills.
Alyssa, I'm wondering about acceptance and rejection criteria. For you to accept or reject an assignment, I presume a case has to have a solid clinical foundation, but is there like wiggle room there? Is there a prime case for the use of your service, or will any case do?
Yeah. So I think if I understand your question right, it sounds like you're kind of leaning toward the speaking about medical malpractice and medical negligence and identifying whether the case has merit. And that's actually part of the services that a legal nurse consultant can offer, is to help the a nurse practitioner consultant to the legal profession or a legal nurse consultant can offer, is to identify whether the case does or does not have merit. And of course, in the case of medical malpractice or medical negligence, you're looking for violations in the standard of care. First and foremost, that duty to provide care, breaches in the standard of care, and then causation, where you can draw a clear narrative between that violation and the actual outcome clinical outcome for the patient. And then, of course, damages sufficient to justify the cost of litigation.
Now, you talked a minute ago
Always.
about employing nurse consultants in-house, but I want to be clear. Why should they not be in-house people?
In-house is an option. I'm not saying that people shouldn't necessarily hire in-house, but I think there's things you need to consider for your firm and the volume of cases that you typically take, and whether it's worth putting someone on as a W-2, which can involve paying for benefits and things like that. There may be times where if you don't have enough volume for that nurse, she's just putting her feet on the desk and you're paying her to put her feet on the desk because there's really no clinical work to be had. And so you have to ask yourself what kind of volume you see come through that involves medical records before you make that decision. But also consider the fact that if you put a legal nurse consultant, I keep wanting to say illegal nurse consultant, a legal nurse consultant, if you put a legal nurse consultant to work in your firm full time, then they're not available to be practicing clinically. And so you're going to see that over time. I've come across firms that say, "Oh, we've had a legal nurse consultant in-house for 20 years," and I say, "Well, that's interesting. So it's been 20 years since she's worked in the hospital setting," because that does make a difference, right? When we're talking about standard of care and violations of standard of care, because those change over time. And the other thing is just realizing that that individual legal nurse consultant is going to have a certain background clinically, and they're either going to be a Jack or Jill of all trades, where they've had 2 years in the well baby and 2 years in obstetrics and 1 year on med surg and 2 years in the OR and 1 year in the emergency room, or they're going to have had a solid career in one area, because there's only so many years that a particular career can last. And so they may have possibly 10 years in the ER and 15 years in the OR. That would be a rare combination, but you might find that. But then when you come across a birth injury case, is that nurse going to be a good nurse to help you with that case? And so you have to consider when hiring in-house that whatever specialty background that individual has, and I would recommend leaning towards a general background in medical surgical nursing, then they're not going to have that specialty when a birth injury case comes through, when a surgical injury comes through where a bad outcome occurred on the surgical table. They're not going to necessarily be able to help with cases that involve anesthesia or obstetrics, et cetera. So you'd want to, in those cases, as I said before, in the best interest of that plaintiff for that case, that's why I recommend contracting for each individual case.
With regard to Bob's question, would you differentiate defense and plaintiff? I presume, because of resources, that an in-house consultant would more likely be on the defense side than the plaintiff side, because they can afford it. But is it
right and
typical for an in-house nurse to be working in a plaintiff firm? Or is that atypical?
Yeah, I don't see that very often unless the plaintiff firm is very, very niched in medical malpractice and medical negligence, because they just don't have the volume to feed someone a full-time salary. So,
and if they do, I would imagine that they would have the in-house person and then in fact hire the specialist or use that consultant to retain the specialist. Yes?
Right. Well, what I recommend when people already have a in-house legal nurse consultant is just to connect yourself with a firm that has a bunch of specialty nurse practitioners or legal nurse consultants, because then that individual can reach outward when they need to and can access other people in the medical arena or the clinical arena to ask questions to when needed. And so if you can find a firm like Discovery, NP Legal Consultants, that's something that we offer, is something that where you can just sort of have an ad hoc relationship with a group of specialists where that nurse can reach out. In the hospital, nurses need to reach out occasionally to a physician, to a specialist, to a nurse practitioner who actually provides orders to nurses, just like a physician does. And so it stands to reason that in the field of legal nurse consulting and in the world of the the world of trial attorneys that a legal nurse consultant, RN, would need to reach outward and upward sometimes to get the specialty knowledge that they need.
Everything is specialized these days. In terms of your search for a nurse consultant, an expert for your case, are you always better off hiring the consultant that has expertise in the specific medical issue that drives your case? Or are there situations where a general practitioner would be a better choice?
It really depends on the nature of the case. I would say in most cases, it's best to go with a specialist, unless you are dealing with a specialty case. If you were to ask a mother who lost a child due to a preventable birth injury and asked her, would you like me to hire a generalist or a specialist? I think most plaintiffs would prefer that you hire a specialist, and you're going to have a much stronger case, which is going to theoretically result in a higher winnings and therefore higher profit.
Okay. As our listeners know, Mark is an advocate of justice. He likes to see people treated fairly in the criminal and civil justice systems. Now, how does a nurse consultant balance the scales and help people get justice in both systems?
In the criminal and civil system, is that what you're asking about?
Yeah.
So my work has been primarily in the civil realm, so I really can't speak from a personal experience level in the criminal arena. However, I am aware of legal nurse consultants that do offer services to kind of help understand what happened in homicide cases or sexual assault cases, and kind of corroborate what the reported injuries are with what they see physically. That's just not something that that our team has done.
Alyssa, I presume we're talking about forensics, right?
Yeah, I think I thought the question was about criminal versus civil.
It was, but where a nurse consultant would come in, I presume, is in evaluating the forensics. Yes.
Yes, yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah. And again, that's not something I have personal experience to speak to on that level, because I've chosen to kind of niche in the medical malpractice, medical negligence space. But I do know that you can find specialty legal nurse consultants that help with things like that.
And where does the scales get balanced? How is justice done, and how do you help? If I can be so.
Sure. Well, legal nurse consultants can be used on both sides. It just, as we were speaking before, typically legal nurse consultants who want more of a stable income and want to be marketing themselves less, because let's face it, nurses are not born marketers. And so some of them just really dislike the idea of having to go out and market their services independently. And so a good position for them would be an in-house legal nurse consultant, which is often defense side. But independent legal nurse consultants can, make the effort to go and market themselves, and can work on the plaintiff side more often. And again, we can have in-house on the plaintiff side, just not as common. And so you can see nurses being used on both sides of that. And what I like about the behind the scenes aspect, as opposed to the testifying expert aspect, is that a behind the scenes consultant will let you know the good, the bad, and the ugly about your case, what is supportive of your position, and what will be something that you need to be prepared for at trial, because the opposing counsel will bring that up. And that's important. It's important to know that in advance. A lot of times testifying experts, in an effort to stay strong in their own stance about what they feel, they often will downplay or not necessarily bring to your attention those parts of the record that may not support their own narrative about what happened. And so when you find that out while cross-examining someone, or while your witness is being cross-examined, that can be not a good moment for a trial attorney.
I want to get to the nitty-gritty of what you do. Lawyer retains you. You do your evaluation, or I presume it depends on the type of case he hires you for, but does he expect a personal visit? Does he get a report of some sort? Does the consultant meet with the client? What kind of work product does the lawyer receive? And I presume he should expect it to help him achieve a fair settlement or a better result at trial. Yes?
Right. And I can really only speak to the type of work product that we do in the medical negligence and medical malpractice arena. What you should look for in when you hire a legal nurse consultant is whether that legal nurse consultant will, you should always ask for work product samples to kind of understand how they present their findings to you. And a typical work product will include a chronology, which is fairly basic, and will also include some form of an analysis, ideally, although I have had many attorneys ask me whether I'm just regurgitate the record the same way that it's written, only in a summarized form, because they tend to get that a lot, especially some of these overseas solutions that do chronologies. A lot of times the complaint is that it's essentially just a regurgitated version of the record with no analysis at all. Even if it's supposedly an MD overseas or a physician, they tend to not get, the complaints I hear is they tend to not get analysis integrated into that work product. And that's what you're paying for. You're paying for the clinical expertise of that person, not just the clinical knowledge base. Those are really two different things. You have the clinical knowledge base, which is important when doing data entry to know what you're entering and what it means. But what's important about the analytical piece is that you get the opinion and the analysis of that person behind the scenes. And I realize that you then have to go find the testifying expert to corroborate that and to present that as testimony, but you can now extract that more easily from the testifying expert because you know what questions to ask. So as far as the work product goes, though, you do want a solid chronology, ideally something that can be rearrangeable, sortable, searchable. You want something that also presents some kind of opinion in some form or another, and not just a regurgitation of the facts.
If you render a negative opinion, is that discoverable?
Not as a behind-the-scenes legal nurse consultant. That is one of the primary differences and distinctions between a testifying consultant and a testifying expert and a consultant expert, is that the consultant expert is all that communication and correspondence is subject to privilege and is not discoverable, which is an advantage because I can tell that attorney when there are elements of the medical record that are not in alignment with his narrative or her narrative, so that we can discuss whether it might be a good time to talk about settling.
From a compensation standpoint, I presume that being an independent versus an in-house is the same as being a sole practitioner or being a corporate lawyer. You have an entrepreneurial spirit or you don't. You want to reach for the sky or you don't. Is that right? Why would somebody choose in-house versus independent? Because they. Are
you asking why a legal nurse consultant would choose that route, or why an attorney would?
No, a nurse consultant. Why would a nurse consultant prefer to be independent rather than in-house, get a salary rather than worry about her next paycheck, that kind of thing?
It's so individual, and I love that you asked that question because I actually have a group of nurse practitioners on social media. It's the only group that I'm aware of that is nurse practitioners that are interested in becoming legal nurse consultants. And so far, there's a couple hundred of them. And in that group, when I first opened that group, just to get some engagement, I asked them, I said, would you rather open your own consulting firm and hand cases out to subcontractors, or would you rather, work from home and receive cases from someone else? And surprisingly, at least it was surprising to me, 20-1, the nurse practitioners in this group just wanted cases handed to them. And so and then another option on that poll was, would you rather work in-house for an attorney? And I did see a handful of them that would like to work in-house for an attorney. The advantages to working in-house for a law firm or for an attorney is that supposedly it's steady, predictable paycheck. The advantages of working as a subcontractor is that you don't have to market yourself. Disadvantage is that the contractor who hands you the work takes their cut off the top. And so, but the disadvantage to being a contractor is that you have to hustle. You have to go out and find work, and you have to present yourself, you have to market yourself, and you have to position yourself as an expert in your field, both clinically and as a legal nurse consultant in your specialty in that realm.
Okay. Well, that's understandable. I can see why, there would be something there for each type of individual. Uh, but as an independent, you can probably end up making a better living than if you're working for somebody
If you
else,
hustle,
right?
that's for sure.
It's true. It does take a lot of hustle. That
Yeah.
is something I can definitely say. It takes a lot of hustle to get off the ground. And depending on how you choose to launch yourself, many legal nurse consultants choose to launch as an individual. And most of the independent legal nurse consultants out there that are out hustling and marketing, most of them are individuals who have a network of people and they sort of subcontract to each other. So there are databases and networks out there where we can subcontract to each other. There's whole, underground communities of legal nurse consultants you know nothing about, but we definitely subcontract out to each other. What's unique about kind of the approach that I took was that I actually spent about 6 months recruiting nurse practitioner specialty talent, which, as I said, only about 3.5% of nurses become nurse practitioners. And then on top of that, only about half of those specialize. And so I recruited and hand selected specialists, and then we launched as a group. So that took quite a bit more capital and time to get off the ground than someone who launches as an individual and then maybe adds a subcontractor and a second subcontractor and a third subcontractor and grows that way. So it just depends how one chooses to launch. But certainly, if you are a contractor and you subcontract to others, there's really you stop selling your own time. Now you're able to broker other people's time, and so there's more potential in that, but it's not for the faint of heart.
Well, it looks to me like Elisa has a little bit of a marketing edge to her personality. I think you enjoy that, don't you?
I actually do enjoy the entrepreneur aspect of it. Yes, I think I started with that attitude, and then legal nurse consulting just so happened to be the business that I ultimately ran with. Yeah, but it does take a certain personality type, and there are many legal nurse consultants that will come and go. And actually, how that affects the attorney and the law firm is that you may hire a legal nurse consultant, and he or she will take the case on. And then, as you're getting ready for trial 2 years down the road, there is a chance that legal nurse consultant will no longer be in the industry because they just couldn't cut it. It was just too difficult to hustle while also working clinically. I no longer work clinically because I'm just organizing my group of nurse practitioner consultants to the legal profession. But it is very common to find that legal nurse consultants will enter into the field all starry-eyed, that convinced that they're going to have the phone ringing off the hook. And once they discover that they actually have to hustle to find work, then a lot of them will kind of fade into the background. And so you have a lot of legal nurse consultants on LinkedIn that actually aren't even on LinkedIn anymore, or maybe they still have their headline still says legal nurse consultant. Some of them are on LinkedIn, but they just don't have the personality to put themselves out there. And so, there's a lot to know when you're looking for a legal nurse consultant. It's, you can't just go to LinkedIn and search LNC because you're going to be seeing those people who aren't on LinkedIn anymore, or who are on LinkedIn, but they're not hustling. Maybe they've never done a case. They just put up a shingle and said, hey, I'm a legal nurse consultant now. There's no regulation to stop them from doing that. Mm-hmm. So it is tricky to vet legal nurse consultants. But I would say if you search for a nurse practitioner, and if you search even just Googling nurse practitioner and the specialty and then legal consultant, then you're a lot better off than, say, searching LinkedIn, because LinkedIn is going to give you thousands of people who were a legal nurse consultant at one point, or maybe they have done a case, or maybe they have aspirations to become one, but they haven't done any cases yet. There's all sorts of variation in experience on LinkedIn.
That's a good point, though. Where is the best place to find a nurse consultant?
I would say, sadly, your best bet. I mean, you can try LinkedIn, but then it's going to be once you've engaged a legal nurse consultant in conversation about whether they're the right person, you may have a hard time getting rid of them if they are kind of somewhat up the alley, but they're not quite right for you. It may be difficult to, because again, they're hustling. And so it may be difficult to kind of shut them down and say, no, I actually think I need to go this other direction. And so LinkedIn is an option, but you also have to be aware that once you engage in conversation with someone, then you have to be prepared to tell them they may not be the right person. But when you Google legal nurse consultants, virtually everything you're going to come across is training for legal nurse consultants, how to become a legal nurse consultant, for pages and pages. It's very difficult to find legal nurse consultants. If you're interested in engaging a nurse practitioner consultant to the legal profession, many of them, as our team does, bill RN rates. And so you might as well, but you can search for nurse practitioner on Google, nurse practitioner consultant to the legal profession. And then you can put the specialty, for example, nurse practitioner obstetrics consultant to the legal profession, nurse practitioner neonatal or NICU consultant to the legal profession. You can also try Googling just simply the specialty and legal nurse consultant. But again, you may run into a lot of material that is specific to learning how to become a legal nurse consultant.
I would suggest local and national trial lawyer associations. No.
Yeah, you can also search on, I believe AALNC is an option, again, because 96.5% of nurses, 96% of RNs, 96% of nurses are not nurse practitioners. You're going to see that reflected in a database like AALNC, that 96% of them or more are going to be RNs. It's really rare actually to come across nurse practitioner consultants to the legal profession. And my theory on that is because nurse practitioners don't tend to think outside the box in terms of their career as much as RNs do, because nurse practitioners consider themselves to already have reached the pinnacle of their career, and they don't always, remove those blinders to say, well, maybe there's a different way that I can use my knowledge and education and experience to be successful. And so I do see that RNs tend to think that way a little bit more than nurse practitioners, and that's why you don't see nurse practitioners in the field. I wouldn't even say 3.5%. I would say that it is a lower percent in the field of legal nurse consulting, that there's fewer nurse practitioners than there are just in the general population of nurses.
This has been very educational. Is there anything else you'd like to add? Is there anything you want lawyers out there in lawyer land to know? In justice land? Justice counts on this show.
Yeah, that's true. Justice definitely counts. And I would just reiterate what I've said before, that, don't fall victim to the mentality that hiring a nurse practitioner consultant to the legal profession or a legal nurse consultant is going to be more expensive for you. And don't get hung up on the expense of it, because ultimately you're saving tens of thousands of dollars on the other end by having that medical record already sorted out, being able to hand that testifying expert something that is organized so that they spend many, many fewer hours, not to mention the fewer hours that you'll spend digging through the medical record if you have someone look through it in advance and kind of point out the things to you that are important to know.
Great advice. Robin?
Now, Lisa, I understand that you have launched your own podcast.
That's right. Yeah, just recently, yes. I launched a podcast called Discovering the Needle, and it's a podcast where legal nurse consultants help attorneys to discover what they didn't know that they didn't know about how to win their medical malpractice case. And so it is specific to medical malpractice attorneys for the plaintiff to help them understand how legal nurse consultants can specifically help them locate and isolate and articulate those issue spotting in the medical record for standard of care and causation.
All right. Well, Elisa, thanks so much for joining us today.
You're very welcome. It's been my pleasure.
Mark and I are really grateful. And everybody, thanks for taking a listen to this one. Meanwhile, if you haven't done so already, you need to check out Mark Bellow's Ripped from the Headlines legal thrillers. They're all available on Amazon and other major online booksellers. He has quite the hero in attorney Zachary Blake, who fights for justice on all fronts. I don't think he's written about nurse practitioners, but maybe he'll have to do that.
have not. I have not. That's my next novel.
That's your next one. Anyway, his books are Betrayal of Faith, Betrayal of Justice, Betrayal in Blue, Betrayal in Black, Betrayal High, Supreme Betrayal, Betrayal at the Border, and his latest, You Have the Right to Remain Silent. And that one's won a couple of really prestigious awards recently. For more information, just check markmbello.com. Now, until next time, this is Bob Gaddy for Mark Bello signing off from Justice Council.